Welcome back, everybody. Okay, I'm going to continue to read Caliban and the Witch, the Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation by Sylvia Federici. And we have made it to chapter 2, amazingly. I don't know how, but here we are. Let's look at it. Okay. The accumulation of labor and the degradation of women. Constructing difference in the transition to capitalism. And here's a cool woodcut. Their butts look crazy. Okay, this is Albrecht Dürer's The Fall of Man. This powerful scene on the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden evokes the expulsion of the peasantry from its common lands, which was starting to occur across Western Europe at the very time when Dürer was producing his work. Getting expelled like shit. Okay, again she starts with some quotes. So let me read them. I demand whether all wars, bloodshed, and misery came not upon the creation when one man endeavored to be a lord over another, and whether this misery shall not remove when all the branches of mankind shall look upon the earth as one common treasury to all. Gerard Winstanley, The New Law of Righteousness, 1649. Fair. To him she was a fragmented commodity, whose feelings and choices were rarely considered. Her head and her heart were separated from her back and her hands, and divided from her womb and vagina. Her back and muscle were pressed into field labor. Her hands were demanded to nurse and nurture the white man. Her vagina, used for his sexual pleasure, was the gateway to the womb, which was his place of capital investment. The capital investment being the sex act and the resulting child, the accumulated surplus. That was Barbara O'Mallady, Heart of Darkness, 1983. This book is crazy. Okay. Part 1, Introduction. The development of capitalism was not the only possible response to the crisis of feudal power. Throughout Europe, vast communalistic social movements and rebellions against feudalism had offered the promise of a new egalitarian society built on social equality and cooperation. However, by 1525, their most powerful expression, the Peasant War in Germany, or as Peter Blickel called it, the Revolution of the Common Man, was crushed. 100,000 rebels were massacred in retaliation. Then in 1535, New Jerusalem, the attempt made by the Anabaptists in the town of Munster to bring the kingdom of God to earth, also ended in a bloodbath, first undermined presumably by the patriarchal turn taken by its leaders, who, by imposing polygamy, caused women among their ranks to revolt. With these defeats compounded by the spreads of witch hunts and the effects of colonial expansion, the revolutionary process in Europe came to an end. Military might was not sufficient, however, to avert the crisis of feudalism. By the late Middle Ages, the feudal economy was doomed, faced with an accumulation crisis that stretched for more than a century. We deduce its dimension from some basic estimates indicating that between 1350 and 1500, a major shift occurred in the power relation between workers and masters. The real wage increased by 100%. Prices declined by 33%. Rents also declined. The length of the working day decreased, and a tendency appeared toward local self-sufficiency. Evidence of a chronic disaccumulation trend in this period is also found in the pessimism of the contemporary merchants and landowners, and the measures which the European states adopted to protect markets, suppress competition, and force people to work at the conditions imposed. As the entries in the registers of the feudal manors recorded, the work was not worth the breakfast. T. The feudal economy could not reproduce itself, nor could a capitalist society have evolved from it, for self-sufficiency and the new high-wage regime allowed for the wealth of the people, but excluded the possibility of capitalistic wealth. That was a quote from Marx. It was in response to this crisis that the European ruling class launched the global offensive that in the course of at least 3 centuries was to change the history of the planet, laying the foundations of a capitalist world system in the relentless attempt to appropriate new sources of wealth, expand its economic basis, and bring new workers under its command. As we know, conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, and brief force were the pillars of this process. Thus, the concept of a transition to capitalism is in many ways a fiction. British historians in the 1940s and 50s used it to define a period, roughly from 1450 to 1650, in which feudalism in Europe was breaking down while no new social economic system was yet in place, though elements of a capitalist society were taking shape. The concept of transition, then, helps us to think of a prolonged process of change and of societies in which capitalist accumulation coexisted with political formations not yet predominantly capitalistic. The term, however, suggests a gradual, linear historical development, whereas the period it names was among the bloodiest and most discontinuous in world history, one that saw apocalyptic transformation and which historians can only describe in the harshest terms: the Iron Age, the Age of Plunder, and the Age of the Whip. Transition, then, cannot evoke the changes that paved the way to the advent of capitalism and the forces that shaped them. In this volume, therefore, I use the term primarily in a temporal sense, while I refer to the social processes that characterize the feudal reaction and the development of capitalist relations with the Marxian concept of primitive accumulation. Oh, alright. Though I agree with its critics that we must rethink Marx's interpretation of it. So that's what primitive accumulation is. The social processes that characterize the feudal relation and the development of capitalist relations. Marx introduced the concept of primitive accumulation at the end of Capital, Volume 1, to describe the social and economic restructuring that the European ruling class initiated in response to its accumulation crisis, and to establish, in polemics with Adam Smith, that 1. Capitalism could not have developed without a prior concentration of capital and labor, and 2. The divorcing of the workers from the means of production, not the abstinence of the rich, is the source of capitalist wealth. Not the abstinence of the rich. Primitive accumulation, then, is a useful concept, for it connects the feudal reaction with the development of a capitalist economy, and it identifies the historical, it must mean feudal relation, it must be a typo, right? I don't know. And it identifies the historical and logical conditions for the development of the capitalist system. Primitive, originary, indicating a precondition for the existence of capitalist relations as much as a specific event in time. Marx, however, analyzed primitive accumulation almost exclusively from the viewpoint of the waged industrial proletariat, the protagonist, in his view, of the revolutionary process of his time and the foundation for the future communist society. Thus, in his account, primitive accumulation consists essentially in the expropriation of the land from the European peasantry and the formation of the free, independent worker, though he acknowledged that the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population of America, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of black skins, are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. That was Marx. Damn. That was crazy. I'm gonna read that again, okay? Okay. Let me read her introduction. Thus, in his account, primitive accumulation consists essentially in the expropriation of the land from the European peasantry and the formation of the free, independent worker, although he acknowledged that the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population of America, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of black skins, are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. And primitive accumulation is like the basis of our entire capitalist world system. So like our entire capitalist world system was built on like robbery and murder. Historically, like you can trace it. Marx also recognized that a great deal of capital, which today appears in the United States without any certificate of birth, was yesterday in England. Okay, a great deal of capital, which today appears in the United States without any certificate of birth, was yesterday in England the capitalized blood of children. By contrast, we do not find in his work any mention of the profound transformations that capitalism introduced in the reproduction of labor power and the social position of women. Nor does Marx's analysis of primitive accumulation mention the great witch hunt of the 16th and 17th centuries, although this state-sponsored terror campaign was central to the defeat of the European peasantry, facilitating its expulsion from the lands it once held in common. In this chapter and those that follow, I discuss these developments, especially with reference to Europe, arguing that 1. The expropriation of European workers from their means of subsistence, and the enslavement of Native Americans and Africans to the mines and plantations of the New World, were not the only means by which a world proletariat was formed and accumulated. 2. This process required the transformation of the body into a work machine, and the subjugation of women to the reproduction of the workforce. Most of all, it required the destruction of the power of women, which in Europe and as in America was achieved through the extermination of the witches. That's T. 3. Primitive accumulation, then, was not simply an accumulation and concentration of exploitable workers and capital. It was also an accumulation of differences and divisions within the working class. Whereby hierarchies built upon gender as well as race, she has race and age, became constitutive of class rule and the formation of the modern proletariat. 4. We cannot therefore identify capitalist accumulation with the liberation of the worker, female or male, as many Marxists, among others, have done, or see the advent of capitalism as a moment of historical progress. On the contrary, capitalism has created more brutal and insidious forms of enslavement, as it has planted into the body of the proletariat deep divisions that have served to intensify and conceal exploitation. It is in great part because of these imposed divisions, especially those between women and men, that capitalist accumulation continues to devastate life in every corner of the planet. And what? Capitalist accumulation and the accumulation of labor in Europe. Capital, Marx wrote, comes on the face of the earth, dripping blood and dirt from head to toe. And indeed, when we look at the beginning of capitalist development, we have the impression of being in an immense concentration camp. In the New World, we have the subjugation of the aboriginal populations to the regimes of the Mita and Quetzalcoatl, under which multitudes of people were consumed to bring silver and mercury to the surface in the mines of Huancavelica and Potosi. In Eastern Europe, we have a second serfdom, tying to the land a population of farmers who had never previously been enserfed. In Western Europe, we have the enclosures, the witch hunt, the branding, whipping, and incarceration of vagabonds and beggars in newly constructed workhouses and correction houses, models for the future prison system. On the horizon, we have the rise of the slave trade, while on the seas, ships are already transporting indentured servants and convicts from Europe to America. What we deduce from this scenario is that force was the main lever, the main economic power in the process of primitive accumulation, because capitalist development required an immense leap in the wealth appropriated by the European ruling class and the number of workers brought under its command. In other words, primitive accumulation consisted in an immense accumulation of labor power, dead labor in the form of stolen goods, and living labor in the form of human beings made available for exploitation, realized on a scale never before matched in the course of history. Significantly, the tendency of the capitalist class during the first 3 centuries of its existence was to impose slavery and other forms of coerced labor as the dominant work relation, a tendency limited only by the workers' resistance and the danger of the exhaustion of the workforce. This was true not only in the American colonies, where by the 16th century economies based on coerced labor were forming, but in Europe as well. Later I examined the importance of slave labor and the plantation system in capitalist accumulation. Here I want to stress that in Europe too, in the 15th century, slavery, never completely abolished, was revitalized. As reported by the Italian historian Salvatore Bono, to whom we owe the most extensive study of slavery in Italy, there were numerous slaves in the Mediterranean areas in the 16th and 17th centuries, and their numbers grew after the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 that escalated the hostilities against the Muslim world. Bono calculates that more than 10,000 slaves lived in Naples and 25,000 in the Neapolitan kingdom as a whole. But it's not like Neapolitan, like the ice cream. 1% of the population. And similar figures appear to other Italian towns and to southern France. In Italy, a system of public slavery developed whereby thousands of kidnapped foreigners, the ancestors of today's undocumented immigrant workers, were employed by city governments for public works, or were farmed out to private citizens who employed them in agriculture. Many were destined for the oars, an important source of such employment being the Vatican fleet. Slavery is that form of exploitation towards which the master always strives. Isn't that true? Europe was no exception. This must be emphasized to dispel the assumption of a special connection between slavery and Africa. But in Europe, slavery remained a limited phenomenon as the material conditions for it did not exist, although the employer's desires for it must have been quite strong if it took until the 18th century before slavery was outlawed in England. The attempt to bring back serfdom failed as well, except in the East where population scarcity gave landlords the upper hand. In the West, its restoration was prevented by peasant resistance, culminating in the German Peasant War. A broad organizational effort spreading over 3 countries, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and joining workers from every field, farmers, miners, artisans, including the best German and Austrian artists. This revolution of the common man was a watershed in European history. Like the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, it shook the powerful to the core, merging in their consciousness with the Anabaptist takeover of Munster, which confirmed their fears that an international conspiracy was underway to overthrow their power. After its defeat, which occurred in the same year as the conquest of Peru, and which was commemorated by Albrecht Dürer with the monument to the vanquished peasants, the revenge was merciless. Thousands of corpses laid on the ground from Thuringia to Alsace, in the fields, in the woods, in the ditches of 1,000 dismantled, burned castles, murdered, tortured, impaled, martyred. But the clock could not be turned back. In various parts of Germany and the other territories that had been at the center of the war, customary rights and even forms of territorial government were preserved. This was an exception. Where workers' resistance to reinsertment could not be broken, the response was the expropriation of the peasantry from its land and the introduction of forced wage labor. Workers attempting to hire themselves out independently or leave their employers were punished with incarceration and even with death, in the case of recidivism. A free wage labor market did not develop in Europe until the 18th century. And even then, contractual wage work was obtained only at the price of an intense struggle and by a limited set of laborers, mostly male and adult. Nevertheless, the fact that slavery and serfdom could not be restored meant that the labor crisis that had characterized the late Middle Ages continued in Europe into the 17th century, aggravated by the fact that the drive to maximize the exploitation of labor put in jeopardy the reproduction of the workforce. This contradiction, which still characterizes capitalist development, exploded most dramatically in the American colonies, where work, disease, and disciplinary punishments destroyed 2/3 of the Native American population in the decades immediately after the conquest. It was also at the core of the slave trade and the exploitation of slave labor. Millions of Africans died because of the torturous living conditions to which they were subjected during the Middle Passage and on the plantations. Never in Europe did the exploitation of the workforce reach such genocidal proportions, except under the Nazi regime. Even so, there too, in the 16th and 17th centuries, land privatization and the commodification of social relations, the response of lords and merchants to their economic crisis, caused widespread poverty, mortality, and an intense resistance that threatened to shipwreck the emerging capitalist economy. This, I argue, is the historical context in which the history of women and reproduction in the transition from feudalism to capitalism must be placed. For the changes which the advent of capitalism introduced in the social position of women, especially at the proletarian level, whether in Europe or America, were primarily dictated by the search for new sources of labor as well as new forms of regimentation and division of the workforce. Here's a peasant unfurling a banner that says freedom. And here is the Albrecht Dürer Monument to the Vanquished Peasants. And it says, this picture, representing a peasant enthroned on a collection of objects from his daily life, is highly ambiguous. It can suggest that the peasants were betrayed or that they themselves should be treated as traitors. Accordingly, it has been interpreted either as a satire of the rebel peasants or as a homage to their moral strength. What we know with certainty is that Dürer was profoundly perturbed by the events of 1525, and as a convinced Lutheran, must have followed Luther in his condemnation of the revolt. But before she was talking about how women's new social position was primarily dictated by the search for new sources of labor as well as new forms of regimentation and division of the workforce. In support of this statement, I trace the main developments that shaped the advent of capitalism in Europe: land privatization, and the price revolution, to argue that neither was sufficient to produce a self-sustaining process of proletarianization. I then examine in broad outlines the policies which the capitalist class introduced to discipline, reproduce, and expand the European proletariat, beginning with the attack it launched on women, resulting in the construction of a new patriarchal order, which I define as the patriarchy of the wage. Lastly, I look at the production of racial and sexual hierarchies in the colonies, asking to what extent they could form a terrain of confrontation or solidarity between indigenous African and European women, and between women and men. Okay, stop here. Good job, everyone. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more. Night, y'all.